Hello friends, and welcome to Sacred Slumber. I hope your day has been filled with blessings, no matter what time you're joining us or where you are in this beautiful world. Before we begin tonight's journey into the remarkable story of Gideon, I want to invite you to subscribe to Sacred Slumber so you never miss these powerful biblical narratives that can transform your heart and strengthen your faith. Now let's settle in as we explore one of the most extraordinary accounts of courage, faith, and divine intervention in all of Scripture. The sun hung low over the hills of Israel, casting long shadows across a land that had once flowed with milk and honey. But those days seemed like distant memories now. The once prosperous nation had fallen into chaos, its people scattered and hiding like frightened animals. For 7 long years, the Midianites had swept down upon Israel like locusts, devouring everything in their path. Picture, if you will, the terror that gripped every village and farmstead. Families would wake each morning not knowing if this would be the day the raiders would come. Fathers would venture out to check their crops, only to find them trampled and stolen. Children would be hushed to silence at the first sound of hoofbeats on the horizon. The very air seemed thick with fear and desperation. The Midianites, along with their allies, the Amalekites, and other eastern peoples, had turned the conquest of Israel into an annual ritual. Like a plague of locusts, they would arrive at harvest time, their camels beyond counting, stretching across the landscape as far as the eye could see. They would strip the land bare, taking not only the grain and livestock, but also crushing the spirits of God's chosen people. Farmers had abandoned their fields, choosing instead to hide in mountain caves and underground chambers. The marketplaces that once bustled with commerce now stood empty and silent. What should have been a time of celebration and thanksgiving for the harvest had become a season of dread and starvation. Israel's cities, once proud and strong, had crumbled into mere shadows of their former glory. The walls that should have protected the people lay in ruins, and the gates that once welcomed travellers now hung broken on their hinges. It was as if the very blessing of God had departed from the land, leaving behind only sorrow and defeat. In this atmosphere of despair, mothers would gather their children close and whisper the old stories of how God had delivered their ancestors from Egypt, how he had parted the Red Sea and given them victory over mighty enemies. But those stories seemed like fairy tales now, beautiful but impossible dreams from a time when God still cared about his people. The elders of Israel shook their heads in bewilderment. Where was the God of Abraham, Isaac and Jacob? Where was the mighty deliverer who had once fought for them? Had he forgotten his covenant? Had he abandoned them to their enemies forever? It was into this world of darkness and desperation that our story begins, in the small town of Ophrah, where a young man named Gideon was about to discover that God had not forgotten his people, after all. But Gideon, like so many others, had lost hope. He had watched his family's livelihood disappear year after year, and he had grown tired of empty promises and unanswered prayers. On this particular day, as storm clouds gathered on the horizon, both literally and figuratively, Gideon was engaged in the dangerous work of threshing wheat. But he wasn't doing it in the traditional threshing floor, where the grain could be properly separated from the chaff by the wind. Instead, he was hidden away in a wine press, a place where grapes were normally crushed to make wine. It was cramped, inefficient, and poorly ventilated, but it offered something more valuable than convenience. It offered concealment from enemy eyes. As Gideon worked in his makeshift hiding place, sweat dripping from his brow in the confined space, he embodied the broken spirit of his entire nation. Here was a man reduced to secret, fearful labour just to provide basic sustenance for his family. The very act of threshing wheat once a joyful community celebration, had become a furtive, isolated struggle for survival. Little did Gideon know that this moment of apparent defeat would become the launching pad for one of the most remarkable displays of God's power in human history. The God who seemed absent was actually watching, waiting, and preparing to use this unlikely hero in ways that would astound both friend and foe alike. The rhythm of Gideon's work was steady but tense. Each strike of his flail against the wheat stalks echoed softly in the confined space of the wine press. His eyes darted frequently toward the opening above, watching for any sign of danger. The precious grain he was salvaging represented not just food for today, but hope for tomorrow, assuming the Midianites didn't discover his hiding place. The silence of the afternoon was broken by an unexpected voice. "The Lord is with you, mighty warrior." Gideon's heart nearly stopped. He spun around, flail raised defensively, expecting to see a Midianite scout who had somehow discovered his secret location. Instead, he found himself face to face with a figure unlike any he had ever encountered. The stranger sat calmly beneath the great oak tree that overlooked the wine press, his presence somehow both commanding and peaceful. The greeting struck Gideon as almost mockingly ironic. Mighty warrior? Him? The man who was reduced to threshing wheat in secret, constantly looking over his shoulder in fear. And the Lord is with you? If that were true, then why was Israel suffering under such devastating oppression? "Pardon me, my lord," Gideon replied, his voice heavy with skepticism and pain. "But if the Lord is with us, why has all this happened to us? Where are all his wonders that our ancestors told us about when they said, 'Did not the Lord bring us up out of Egypt?' But now the Lord has abandoned us and given us into the hand of Midian." The words poured out of Gideon like water from a broken dam. Years of frustration, disappointment, and unanswered questions came tumbling forth. He had grown up hearing the magnificent stories of God's mighty deeds, of pillars of fire and cloud, of armies defeated and nations subdued. But where was that God now? Where were those miracles when his people needed them most? The stranger listened patiently to Gideon's outburst, showing no offence at the young man's boldness or apparent lack of faith. There was something in his eyes that spoke of ancient wisdom and unlimited compassion. When Gideon finished speaking, the visitor's response was both simple and earth-shattering. "Go in the strength you have and save Israel out of Midian's hand. Am I not sending you?" The audacity of the command took Gideon's breath away. Save Israel? Him? The implications were staggering. This wasn't a request for him to join an army or support a cause. This was a divine commission to personally lead the deliverance of an entire nation from a seemingly impossible situation. "Pardon me, my lord," Gideon stammered, his mind reeling, "but how can I save Israel? My clan is the weakest in Manasseh, and I am the least in my family." Gideon's response revealed the depth of his feelings of inadequacy. In a culture where tribal strength and family position determined social standing and influence, he saw himself as doubly disqualified. His clan held no political power, commanded no great armies, and possessed no significant wealth. Within that already weak clan, he was the youngest, the most inexperienced, the least likely to be chosen for any position of leadership. But the stranger's next words would echo through the ages as one of the most profound promises ever given to a human being. "I will be with you, and you will strike down all the Midianites, leaving none alive." The promise was comprehensive and absolute. Not some of the Midianites, not most of them, but all of them. The victory would be complete and decisive, but more importantly, it would not depend on Gideon's strength, wisdom, or experience. It would depend entirely on the presence and power of God himself. Still struggling to believe what he was hearing, Gideon made a request that would reveal both his desire for faith and his need for certainty. If now I have found favour in your eyes, give me a sign that it is really you talking to me. Please do not go away until I come back and bring my offering and set it before you. The stranger agreed to wait, and Gideon hurried to his house to prepare an offering. His heart raced as he worked, his hands trembling slightly as he prepared a young goat and made bread from an ephah of flour. This was not a small offering by the standards of his time, especially for a family struggling under the oppression of constant raids. Yet something within him compelled him to give generously, to honour this mysterious visitor properly. When Gideon returned with the prepared food, the stranger instructed him to place the meat and unleavened bread on a rock and pour out the broth. Gideon obeyed, though he couldn't understand the purpose of these strange instructions. What happened next would leave no doubt about the supernatural nature of his visitor. The stranger touched the meat and bread with the tip of the staff he carried, and immediately fire flared from the rock, consuming the entire offering in an instant. The flames burned with an intensity and heat that no ordinary fire could match, leaving nothing behind but the memory of their brilliance. In that same moment, the stranger vanished from sight, disappearing as suddenly and mysteriously as he had appeared. Terror gripped Gideon's heart as the full realization of what had just occurred crashed over him like a mighty wave. This had been no ordinary man, no mere messenger or prophet. This had been the angel of the Lord, a manifestation of God himself. In that moment of understanding, Gideon was overwhelmed not with joy, but with mortal fear. "Alas, sovereign Lord," he cried out in anguish, "I have seen the angel of the Lord face to face." In the ancient world, it was believed that no human could see God and live. The very encounter that should have filled him with confidence instead filled him with terror. Had his boldness in questioning and testing the Lord sealed his doom? Would he die for having stood in the presence of the Almighty? But even in his moment of greatest fear, God's grace reached out to comfort him. The voice of the Lord came to him again, gentle and reassuring. "Peace, do not be afraid, you are not going to die." With his own hands, Gideon built an altar on that spot and called it, "The Lord is Peace." The place where he had threshed wheat in fear and desperation had become holy ground, the site of a divine encounter that would change not only his life, but the destiny of an entire nation. As night fell over Ophrah, Gideon stood beside his new altar, his mind swirling with the magnitude of what had occurred. The God of his ancestors had not abandoned Israel after all. He had been working, planning, preparing for this very moment, and somehow, incredibly, he had chosen Gideon to be his instrument of deliverance. Yet even as faith began to bloom in his heart, doubt lingered like shadows at the edges of his mind. The task before him seemed impossible, the odds insurmountable. How could he, one man from the weakest clan in Manasseh, possibly hope to defeat the countless multitudes of Midian and their allies? It was a question that would lead him to make one of the most famous requests for divine confirmation in all of Scripture. The days following Gideon's encounter with the angel of the Lord were filled with a mixture of excitement and anxiety. The divine commissioning had been clear and unmistakable, yet the human heart, prone to doubt and fear, struggled to fully embrace what seemed impossible. Gideon found himself caught between the supernatural certainty of his calling and the natural uncertainties of his circumstances. As he went about his daily tasks, Gideon's mind constantly returned to that moment when fire had consumed his offering and the angel had vanished from sight. Had it really happened? In the bright light of day, with the familiar sounds and sights of ordinary life surrounding him, the encounter almost seemed like a dream. Yet the altar he had built stood as a permanent reminder, its stones bearing witness to the reality of what had occurred. Word began to spread quietly through the region about Gideon's calling. Some believed and were filled with hope for the first time in years. Others were sceptical, wondering how this young man could possibly succeed where so many others had failed. Still others were fearful, worried that any attempt at resistance would only bring more severe retaliation from their oppressors. The weight of responsibility pressed heavily on Gideon's shoulders. He was being asked not just to risk his own life, but potentially to lead others to their deaths. What if he had misunderstood? What if his faith had somehow led him astray? The consequences of a mistake would be catastrophic, not just for him, but for all who would follow him. It was in this state of mind that Gideon made his famous request for divine confirmation. The fleece test, as it would come to be known, represented not a lack of faith, but rather a deep desire for certainty in the face of overwhelming responsibility. "If you will save Israel by my hand as you have promised," Gideon prayed earnestly, "look, I will place a wool fleece on the threshing floor. If there is dew only on the fleece, and all the ground is dry, then I will know that you will save Israel by my hand, as you said." The request was specific and measurable. In the normal course of nature, dew would form on all surfaces exposed to the night air. If God could reverse this natural process, causing moisture to collect only on the fleece, while leaving the surrounding ground completely dry, it would serve as an unmistakable sign of divine intervention. Gideon placed the fleece carefully on the threshing floor as evening approached. All through the night he must have awakened periodically, wondering what he would find in the morning. As dawn broke, he hurried to the spot where he had placed his test. What he discovered filled him with wonder and awe. The fleece was thoroughly saturated with dew, so much so that when he wrung it out, he was able to fill an entire bowl with water. Yet all around it, the ground was completely dry, as if an invisible barrier had prevented any moisture from settling anywhere but on the wool. The sign was clear and unmistakable, yet Gideon's human nature craved even greater certainty. The magnitude of what he was being called to do seemed to justify asking for additional confirmation. With remarkable humility and boldness he approached God with yet another request. "Do not be angry with me," Gideon prayed, acknowledging that his repeated testing might seem to indicate a lack of trust. "Let me make just one more request. Allow me one more test with the fleece, but this time make the fleece dry and let the ground be covered with dew." This second test was even more remarkable than the first. It would be one thing for God to cause dew to collect on a single object, while keeping the surrounding area dry, but it would be quite another to keep one small piece of wool completely dry while saturating everything around it. This second sign would demonstrate not just God's power over nature, but his precise control over the smallest details. Again, Gideon placed the fleece on the threshing floor and waited through the night. When morning came, he found exactly what he had requested. The fleece was bone dry without a trace of moisture, while the ground all around it sparkled with heavy dew. The grass, the stones, the nearby trees, everything was wet with the night's moisture, except for that one small piece of wool. God had patiently granted both requests, demonstrating not anger at Gideon's need for reassurance, but understanding and compassion for human weakness. The fleece tests revealed important truths about the nature of faith and the character of God. Faith is not the absence of questions or doubts. Rather, it is the willingness to act in obedience despite those questions and doubts. Moreover, God's response to Gideon's requests showed his patience with those who seek him earnestly. He did not rebuke Gideon for his need for confirmation, nor did he withdraw his calling because of the young man's hesitation. Instead, he graciously provided the assurance that Gideon needed to step forward in faith. The fleece tests also demonstrated the balance between seeking divine guidance and taking action. There comes a point when further testing can become an excuse for inaction, when the desire for certainty becomes a barrier to obedience. Gideon wisely limited his requests to 2 clear signs, then proceeded to act on what he'd received. As news of these miraculous signs spread throughout the tribes of Israel, hope began to stir in hearts that had been dormant for years. Perhaps God had not forgotten them after all. Perhaps deliverance was indeed coming through this unlikely young man from Ophrah. But before Gideon could lead Israel into battle against their oppressors, he would need to assemble an army. The call went out throughout the territories of Manasseh, Asher, Zebulun, and Naphtali. Men who had been hiding in caves and mountain strongholds began to emerge, drawn by the promise of freedom and the reports of God's miraculous confirmations. The response was overwhelming. 32,000 men answered the call, a substantial army by any measure. These were not professional soldiers, but farmers and craftsmen, fathers and sons, united by their hatred of oppression and their desperate hope for liberation. They came carrying whatever weapons they could find, swords that had been hidden from enemy raids, spears hastily fashioned from farming tools, bows that had been used for hunting game in the wilderness. As Gideon looked out over this vast assembly of volunteers, he might have felt a surge of confidence. Surely with 32,000 men, even amateur fighters, he could mount a credible challenge to the Midianite forces. The odds were still daunting, given that the enemy could field armies many times larger, but at least now they had a fighting chance. Yet God had other plans. The fleece tests had been preparation not just for Gideon's faith, but for an even greater demonstration of divine power. The true test was not whether Gideon could trust God with impossible signs, but whether he could trust God with an impossible strategy. What happened next would shock both Gideon and his army, challenging every human assumption about warfare and victory. God was about to demonstrate that his ways are not our ways, and that his power is made perfect, not in human strength, but in human weakness. The morning sun cast long shadows across the camp as 32,000 men prepared for what they believed would be their march to war. Weapons were sharpened, provisions were packed, and final prayers were offered. The air buzzed with nervous energy as farmers turned warriors contemplated the battle that lay ahead. Gideon moved among his troops, offering words of encouragement and trying to project the confidence that a leader must display. Yet privately, he was still awed by the magnitude of what was happening. Just weeks earlier, he had been hiding in a wine press, and now he stood at the head of the largest volunteer army Israel had assembled in generations. But as the army prepared to march toward the enemy encampment, God spoke to Gideon with words that must have sent shockwaves through his entire being. "You have too many men. I cannot deliver Midian into their hands, or Israel would boast against me. Our own strength has saved us." Too many men? The statement seemed to defy all military logic. The Midianites and their allies numbered in the hundreds of thousands. Their camels alone described as being like locusts for multitude. How could 32,000 possibly be considered too many? Yet God's reasoning revealed a profound truth about the nature of divine deliverance. If Israel won the coming battle through conventional military means, they would inevitably credit their victory to their own strength, strategy, and courage. The victory needed to be so obviously supernatural that no one could mistake its source. God's glory was at stake, and that glory could not be shared with human pride. Following God's instructions, Gideon stood before his assembled army and made an announcement that must have stunned many of the volunteers. Anyone who trembles with fear may turn back and leave Mount Gilead. The offer was based on an ancient law found in Deuteronomy, which recognised that fearful soldiers could spread panic through the ranks and actually weaken an army's effectiveness. But in this case, the dismissal served a different purpose entirely. God was beginning the process of reducing the army to a size that would make his intervention unmistakable. The response to Gideon's announcement was immediate and devastating. 22,000 men took advantage of the opportunity to withdraw from what many probably saw as a suicide mission anyway. These were not cowards in the traditional sense. They were ordinary people facing an extraordinary situation, and they chose the safety of their families over the uncertainties of battle. As Gideon watched more than 2/3 of his army walk away, his heart must have sunk. 10,000 men remained, still a respectable force, but far fewer than what seemed necessary for the task ahead. Surely now they could proceed with God's blessing. But God was not finished with his reductions. "There are still too many men," came the divine word. "Take them down to the water, and I will thin them out for you there. If I say, 'This one shall go with you,' he shall go. But if I say, 'This one shall not go with you,' he shall not go." The instruction was puzzling and specific. Gideon was to observe how the men drank water and select his final army based on their drinking method. Of all the criteria that might be used to choose warriors, how they consumed water seemed among the least relevant to military prowess. At the water's edge, the 10,000 men revealed their character through their approach to drinking. The vast majority knelt down and put their faces directly to the water, drinking deeply and focusing entirely on satisfying their thirst. But a small group, only 300 men, demonstrated a different approach. They brought water to their mouths with their hands, lapping it like dogs while maintaining their vigilance and readiness. God's instruction was clear. "With the 300 men that lapped, I will save you and give the Midianites into your hands. Let all the others go home." The reduction was complete and shocking. From 32,000 to 300 represented a decrease of more than 99%. What had begun as a substantial army was now reduced to little more than a large company. The odds, already daunting, had become mathematically absurd. Yet the selection criteria revealed profound spiritual truths. The 300 men who were chosen had demonstrated alertness, self-discipline, and readiness, even in a moment of personal need. While drinking, they had maintained their awareness of their surroundings, prepared for action at a moment's notice. These qualities, while admirable in soldiers, were really symbols of spiritual preparedness and faithfulness. As the dismissed soldiers departed, taking most of the weapons and supplies with them, Gideon was left with 300 men who looked more like a ceremonial guard than a fighting force. The enemy they faced was described in terms that emphasized their overwhelming numbers. All the Midianites, the Amalekites, and the other eastern peoples had settled in the valley, thick as locusts. Their camels could no more be counted than the sand on the seashore. The disparity was so extreme that it moved beyond the realm of military strategy into the realm of the miraculous. No human commander would voluntarily reduce his forces to such a level when facing such overwhelming odds. Yet this was precisely God's point. The victory that was coming would be so clearly divine in origin that no one could attribute it to human planning or prowess. For Gideon, this final reduction must have been the ultimate test of faith. Everything in his military thinking, everything in his natural instincts, everything in conventional wisdom screamed against such a strategy. Yet his experiences with the fleece had prepared him for this moment. He had learned to trust God's ways even when they contradicted human logic. The 300 men who remained showed remarkable faith as well. They could see the enemy forces spread across the valley below them. They knew the odds better than anyone, yet they chose to stay, to trust in the God who had called them through his servant Gideon. As night fell over the Israelite camp, the 300 men prepared for what would be the most unconventional battle in military history. They had no idea that they were about to participate in a victory that would be remembered and celebrated for thousands of years. A victory that would demonstrate God's power to use the weak to confound the mighty. The stage was set for a night that would change everything. The Midianites slept in their countless tents, confident in their overwhelming superiority. The 300 Israelites made their final preparations, trusting in a God who specialized in impossible victories. The hours before dawn are often the darkest, both literally and figuratively. As Gideon and his 300 men crouched in the hills overlooking the vast enemy encampment, the weight of their impossible mission pressed down upon them like a physical burden. The valley below was filled with the tents of their enemies, stretching as far as the eye could see in the starlight, a sea of canvas that housed an army larger than any they had ever faced. Despite the miraculous signs he had witnessed and the divine assurances he had received, Gideon still struggled with doubt. God, in his infinite understanding of human nature, provided one more confirmation before the battle commenced. "Get up, go down against the camp," the Lord instructed, "because I am going to give it into your hands. If you are afraid to attack, go down to the camp with your servant Purah and listen to what they are saying. Afterward, you will be encouraged to attack the camp." The offer revealed God's compassionate understanding of Gideon's anxiety. Rather than rebuking him for his continued fears, the Lord provided an opportunity for reassurance. Taking his servant Purah with him, Gideon crept down toward the perimeter of the enemy camp under cover of darkness. The Midianite camp was massive beyond imagination. Thousands upon thousands of tents housed warriors from multiple nations united in their conquest of Israel. The sounds of the sleeping army filled the night air, snoring soldiers, restless camels, the occasional challenge of sentries. The very scale of the enemy forces should have been overwhelming to any reasonable observer. As Gideon and Purah approached the outer edge of the camp, they overheard a conversation between two Midianite soldiers. One was telling his companion about a disturbing dream he had experienced. "I had a dream. A round loaf of barley bread came tumbling into the Midianite camp. It struck the tent with such force that the tent overturned and collapsed." The interpretation offered by his fellow soldier was even more remarkable. "This can be nothing other than the sword of Gideon, son of Joash, the Israelite. God has given the Midianites and the whole camp into his hands." The irony was profound. Here in the heart of the enemy camp, God was providing confirmation through the mouths of Israel's oppressors themselves. The barley bread in the dream was significant. Barley was considered the food of the poor, inferior to wheat. Yet in the dream, this humble loaf had the power to destroy the entire enemy position. The symbolism was clear. God would use the humble and despised to bring down the mighty and proud. That Gideon's name was already known to the enemy indicated that word of the gathering Israelite resistance had reached their ears. Rather than being encouraged by their overwhelming numerical superiority, some among the Midianites were apparently experiencing anxiety about this upstart Hebrew leader. God was already working in the hearts and minds of the enemy, preparing them for defeat. Gideon and Purah retreated to their own lines, hearts pounding with excitement and renewed confidence. The doubt that had plagued Gideon was finally dispelled by this remarkable confirmation. When they reached the Israelite position, Gideon called his men together for final instructions. "Get up," he announced with newfound authority and confidence. "The Lord has given the Midianite camp into your hands." What followed was perhaps the most unusual battle plan in military history. Instead of swords and spears, Gideon distributed trumpets, empty clay jars, and torches to each of his 300 men. The weapons of conventional warfare were set aside in favour of items that seemed more suited to a religious ceremony than a military campaign. Gideon divided his small force into 3 companies of 100 men each. The strategy was simple, yet audacious. They would surround the enemy camp and, at Gideon's signal, create as much noise and confusion as possible while giving the appearance of a much larger force. "Watch me," Gideon instructed his men. "Follow my lead. When I get to the edge of the camp, do exactly as I do. When I and all who are with me blow our trumpets, then from all around the camp blow yours and shout, 'For the Lord and for Gideon.'" The plan required perfect timing and coordination. Each man would conceal his torch inside a clay jar, maintaining complete darkness and silence until the moment of attack. Then at Gideon's signal, they would simultaneously break their jars, revealing blazing torches, blow their trumpets with all their might, and shout their battle cry. The psychological impact was designed to be devastating. The enemy would suddenly find themselves surrounded by lights and noise, creating the impression of a massive attacking force. In the confusion of a night assault, with limited visibility and the disorientation of being awakened from sleep, even experienced soldiers could panic and lose their sense of direction. As the 3 companies moved into position around the vast perimeter of the enemy camp, each man must have felt the weight of the moment. They were not professional soldiers, but ordinary citizens who had answered the call to fight for their freedom. Now they found themselves in the most critical moment of their lives, armed with the most unconventional weapons imaginable, trusting in a God who had promised victory through seemingly impossible means. The middle watch around midnight was traditionally the time when sentries were changed, and vigilance was often at its lowest point. It was at this precise moment that Gideon and his 100 men reached their assigned position on the edge of the camp. Across the valley, 200 other men waited in similar positions, every eye fixed on their leader for the signal that would begin the battle. Gideon raised his torch-filled jar high above his head, then brought it down sharply, smashing it against a rock. The clay shattered with a sound that seemed to echo across the silent valley, and immediately his torch blazed forth in the darkness. At the same instant, he lifted his trumpet to his lips and blew a long, piercing blast. "For the Lord and for Gideon," he shouted at the top of his lungs. The signal rippled around the camp as 300 jars smashed simultaneously. 300 torches burst into flame, and 300 trumpet heads sounded their defiant call. The battle cry of "For the Lord and for Gideon" echoed from every direction, creating the impression that the Midianite camp was completely surrounded by a massive army. The effect was instantaneous and devastating. Thousands of sleeping soldiers were jolted awake to find their camp surrounded by blazing lights and deafening noise. In the confusion and darkness, panic spread like wildfire through the ranks. Soldiers stumbled from their tents, grabbing whatever weapons they could find, unable to determine the size or direction of the attacking force. In their panic and confusion, the Midianites and their allies began attacking each other. Unable to distinguish friend from foe in the darkness, and hearing battle cries in their own languages from every direction, they assumed they had been betrayed by their allies. The coalition that had seemed so formidable began to tear itself apart. The 300 Israelites maintained their positions around the perimeter, continuing to blow their trumpets and hold their torches high, creating the illusion of a massive army that had the enemy completely surrounded. They watched in amazement as God fulfilled his promise in the most spectacular fashion imaginable. The panic spread throughout the entire camp like a plague. What had begun as confusion quickly escalated into a full-scale rout as the enemy forces fled in every direction, abandoning their weapons, supplies, and even their camels in their desperate attempt to escape what they perceived as certain destruction. The victory was complete and overwhelming, achieved not through superior numbers or military might, but through divine intervention, working through the obedience of 300 faithful men. The God who had called Gideon from his hiding place in the winepress had once again demonstrated that his power is made perfect in human weakness. As dawn broke over the valley, an astonishing sight greeted the 300 Israelites. Where the night before had stood the mighty encampment of Israel's oppressors, now lay only scattered debris and abandoned supplies. Tents stood empty, their guy ropes cut by fleeing soldiers. Weapons lay discarded where they had fallen from panicked hands. The camels that had been described as innumerable as locusts wandered aimlessly, their owners having fled into the wilderness. The ground itself told the story of the night's chaos. Bloodstains marked the spots where confused allies had struck down one another in the darkness. Personal belongings were strewn across the landscape as the fleeing army had abandoned everything that might slow their escape. The scene looked less like the aftermath of a battle and more like the remnants of a catastrophic natural disaster. Gideon and his men moved through the abandoned camp in wonder, scarcely believing what their eyes were witnessing. The victory was so complete, so overwhelming, that it seemed almost too good to be true. Yet the evidence was undeniable. The army that had terrorized Israel for 7 years had been routed by 300 men armed with trumpets and torches. But God's deliverance was not yet complete. Even as the 300 marvelled at what had occurred in the valley, word of the miraculous victory was spreading throughout the hill country of Israel. Men who had dismissed Gideon's call to arms, who had remained hidden in their caves and strongholds, now emerged with renewed courage and determination. The tribes of Naphtali, Asher and Manasseh rallied to pursue the fleeing Midianites. What had begun with 300 faithful men now swelled into a national movement of liberation. The psychological impact of the victory was as important as the military result. The myth of Midianite invincibility had been shattered in a single night, and the spirit of resistance that had been dormant for so long now burst forth like a river breaking through a dam. Gideon sent messengers throughout the hill country of Ephraim with urgent instructions. Come down against the Midianites and seize the waters of the Jordan ahead of them as far as Beth-barah. This strategic move would cut off the enemy's escape routes and ensure that the victory would be complete. The Ephraimites responded with enthusiasm, capturing the fords of the Jordan and trapping many of the fleeing Midianites. In the pursuit that followed, they captured 2 of the Midianite leaders, Oreb and Zeeb, whose names meant raven and wolf. These princes, who had struck terror into Israelite hearts for years, were now defeated and killed at the places that would forever bear their names: the rock of Oreb and the winepress of Zeeb. The pursuit continued beyond the Jordan as Gideon and his original 300, though exhausted, pressed on to capture the remaining Midianite kings, Zaba and Zalmunna. The victory was total and decisive. An empire that had dominated the region for 7 years was completely destroyed in a matter of days. The land of Israel enjoyed peace for 40 years during Gideon's lifetime. The oppression that had driven families into hiding was replaced by prosperity and security. Fields that had been abandoned were cultivated again. Markets that had stood empty bustled with commerce. Children who had grown up knowing only fear could now play freely in their villages. But perhaps the greatest victory was not military but spiritual. Israel had rediscovered that their God was still the same mighty deliverer who had brought their ancestors out of Egypt. The impossible victory served as a permanent reminder that with God all things are possible. The story of Gideon and the 300 speaks across the centuries, with timeless truths that challenge and encourage us today. First, we see that God uses the unlikely. Gideon was not a seasoned warrior or a natural leader. He was a fearful farmer, hiding from his enemies. Yet God saw potential that others missed. This reminds us that God's calling is not based on our qualifications, but on his purposes. Second, the reduction of Gideon's army from 32,000 to 300 demonstrates that faith matters more than numbers. In a world obsessed with statistics and metrics, God's economy operates differently. He delights in using small faithful remnants to accomplish great things, ensuring that his power, not human strength, receives the glory. Third, Gideon's requests for signs teach us about the balance between faith and doubt. God was patient with Gideon's need for confirmation, showing us that honest questions and requests for reassurance are not signs of weak faith but of a heart that desires to walk in God's will. Finally, the story shows us that obedience in the face of fear is the essence of courage. Gideon was afraid, his army was outnumbered, and the strategy seemed foolish. Yet they obeyed, and God honoured their faithfulness with victory. When we feel unqualified for the tasks before us, when the odds seem insurmountable, when we need reassurance before taking steps of faith, the story of Gideon reminds us that our God specialises in impossible victories. He is still calling ordinary people to extraordinary purposes, still using the weak to confound the mighty, still turning fearful hearts into faithful warriors. The God who met Gideon at the winepress is the same God who meets us in our hiding places today, calling us to step out in faith and watch him work miracles through surrendered lives. Just as the 300 trumpets and torches became instruments of divine victory, our simple obedience can become the means through which God accomplishes his purposes in our generation. May we have the courage to answer when he calls, the faith to trust when he leads, and the persistence to follow when he sends us into battles that seem impossible to win. For with God, the 300 can defeat the multitudes, and faith can move mountains that seem immovable. The story of Gideon reminds us that our greatest victories come not when we feel strong and capable, but when we acknowledge our weakness and depend completely on God's strength. In those moments of surrender, we discover that we serve a God who delights in doing the impossible through the most unlikely people. And so the story ends where it began, with an invitation to faith, a call to courage, and a promise that the God who delivered Israel through Gideon and the 300 is still delivering his people today, one impossible victory at a time. Hello, dear friend, and welcome to Sacred Slumber. Before we begin tonight's story, I'd love to know, how has your day been? Whether you're listening to this in the quiet hours of evening, perhaps as the sun sets wherever you are in the world, or if it's late at night and you're ready to rest, I hope you'll find peace in the story we're about to share together. Are you listening from a cosy bedroom in America, perhaps from a small town in England, or maybe from somewhere across the vast expanses of Australia or Canada? Wherever you are, whatever time zone cradles you tonight, you're welcome here. If this is your first time with Sacred Slumber, I invite you to subscribe so these stories can accompany you through many peaceful nights ahead. Now, let's settle in together and journey back to an ancient time, to a small town called Zarephath, where a miracle unfolded that would echo through the ages. The sun blazed mercilessly over the land of Israel, its rays beating down upon cracked earth and withered fields. For 3 long years, not a single drop of rain had fallen from the brass-coloured sky. The rivers had dwindled to dusty beds, lined with sun-bleached stones, and the wells that once bubbled with fresh water now echoed hollow when a stone was dropped into their depths. This terrible drought was no accident of nature. It was the judgment of the Almighty God upon a nation that had turned away from him. King Ahab, weak and easily swayed, had married the pagan princess Jezebel, and together they had led Israel into the worship of false gods, Baal, the supposed god of rain and fertility, and Asherah, the goddess of the sea. Golden calves and wooden idols dotted the landscape, where altars to the true God once stood. Into this spiritual darkness had stepped a man unlike any other, Elijah the Tishbite, a prophet wrapped in rough camel's hair, his eyes blazing with the fire of divine purpose. He had confronted King Ahab with words that still rang in the air. As the Lord God of Israel lives, before whom I stand, there shall not be dew nor rain these years, except at my word. For months after delivering this pronouncement, Elijah had hidden by the brook Cherith, east of the Jordan River. There in that secret place, ravens, those dark messengers of the wilderness, brought him bread and meat each morning and evening, while he drank from the brook's clear waters. It was a time of solitude and communion with God, but even this sanctuary could not last forever. Day by day, Elijah watched the brook grow shallower. The musical babbling that had once lulled him to sleep grew quieter until it was barely a whisper. Soon only scattered puddles remained, then mere dampness in the sand, and finally nothing but a dry bed where life-giving water had once flowed. It was then, when human resources failed and earthly security vanished, that the word of the Lord came to Elijah again. Arise, go to Zarephath, which belongs to Sidon, and dwell there. See, I have commanded a widow there to provide for you. Zarephath. The name meant a place of refining, and how fitting it would prove to be. This small Phoenician town, nestled along the Mediterranean coast north of Israel, was under Gentile rule, beyond the borders of the chosen people, in a land where Baal and Asherah were worshipped openly. Yet it was here, in this unlikely place, that God would work one of his most tender miracles. So Elijah gathered his simple possessions, his mantle, his staff, and the unwavering faith that had sustained him through these years of drought and hiding. The sun was high as he began his journey northward, his feet raising small clouds of dust from the parched earth. Behind him lay the dried brook and the memories of miraculous provision. Ahead lay uncertainty, but also the promise of God's continued care. As he walked, Elijah might have pondered the strangeness of God's ways. Here was a Hebrew prophet, a man who had proclaimed judgment upon Israel for their worship of foreign gods, now being sent to a foreign land where those very gods were revered. Yet if the years had taught him anything, it was that the Lord's thoughts were higher than his thoughts, and the Lord's ways past finding out. The journey from the Jordan Valley to the coastal region of Zarephath would take several days. Elijah travelled through landscapes scarred by drought, abandoned villages where the wells had run dry, fields where the stubble of failed crops crunched beneath his sandals, and hillsides where olive trees stretched their gnarled branches skyward in silent supplication for rain that would not come. At night he slept under stars that seemed to burn with unusual intensity in the clear, dry air. The moon, when it appeared, cast sharp shadows on the lifeless landscape, and sometimes he could hear, in the distance, the mournful cry of jackals searching for water in the empty wadis. But even as the physical landscape spoke of judgment and desolation, Elijah's heart remained anchored in hope. The same God who had sent ravens to feed him, who had made water spring from rock for Moses, who had provided manna in the wilderness for the children of Israel, had promised that a widow in Zarephath would care for him. It seemed impossible, even absurd. What widow in this time of famine would have enough to share? Yet Elijah had learned that impossibility was often the very stage upon which God chose to display his glory. On the third day of his journey, the scent of the sea began to reach his nostrils, carried on breezes that offered little relief from the heat, but spoke of his approaching destination. The landscape gradually changed from the brown hills of inland Palestine to the terraced slopes that descended toward the Mediterranean coast. In the distance, he could see the blue expanse of the Great Sea, its surface shimmering like hammered metal under the relentless sun. As he crested the final hill before Zarephath, Elijah paused to survey the town spread below him. It was modest in size, its flat-roofed houses clustered around a small marketplace, with narrow streets winding between them like tributaries of a dry river. The town's walls, though not as grand as those of the great cities, spoke of a community that had weathered many storms. Fishing boats lay pulled up on the beach, their nets spread out to dry, though in these days of little rain, even the sea seemed less generous with its bounty. Smoke rose from only a few chimneys, a sign that even here, far from Israel, the effects of the drought were being felt. Fuel was precious, when every piece of wood might be needed for cooking what little food remained, and families were learning to make do with cold meals and carefully rationed provisions. As Elijah descended the hill toward the town gate, his stomach reminded him that it had been hours since his last meal. The ravens no longer came with their mysterious daily provision, and the bread in his travelling pouch was long since consumed. For the first time in months, the prophet experienced the gnawing uncertainty that had become the constant companion of countless families throughout the region. But even as hunger and weariness pressed upon him, Elijah's step remained steady. Somewhere in this foreign town was a widow whom God had prepared to be his instrument of provision. The prophet did not know her name, her face, or her circumstances. He knew only that the Lord had spoken, and that was enough. The sun was now approaching its zenith as Elijah neared the gates of Zarephath, his shadow a small dark pool at his feet. Soon, very soon, he would meet the woman through whom God intended to demonstrate that his care extends beyond all human boundaries, his provision beyond all human understanding, and his power beyond even the finality of death itself. The stage was set for a miracle that would begin with a simple request for water and a piece of bread, but would culminate in wonders that neither the prophet nor the widow could have imagined. In this place of refining, in this encounter between a Hebrew man of God and a Gentile woman of faith, the character of the Almighty would be revealed in ways both tender and magnificent. The gates of Zarephath stood open in the midday heat, their wooden beams weathered and worn by countless seasons of sun and storm. As Elijah approached, he could see that the usual bustle of a town entrance was notably absent. No merchants haggled over goods, no children played in the dust, No elders sat in the shade discussing the affairs of the day. The drought and its accompanying famine had drained the life from this place, leaving behind only the essential movements of survival. Elijah's throat was parched from his long journey, and his lips were cracked from the dry air. Each step sent small puffs of dust up from the hard-packed earth, and the prophet found himself scanning the area, hopefully for any sign of a well or fountain. His eyes, accustomed to the blazing light of the Palestinian sun, squinted as he tried to make out the details of his surroundings. It was then that he noticed her. Just outside the town gates, near a grove of scraggly olive trees that had somehow managed to survive the prolonged drought, a woman was bent over, methodically gathering fallen sticks and dead branches. Her movements were slow and deliberate, speaking not of laziness but of the careful conservation of energy that comes from prolonged hunger. Her clothing, once perhaps a deep blue or brown, had faded to the nondescript colour of dust and wear, patched in several places with fabric that didn't quite match. As Elijah drew closer, he could see that she was neither young nor old, but somewhere in that middle season of life, where a woman's beauty becomes less about the freshness of youth and more about the character etched in her features by joy and sorrow, hope and disappointment. Her dark hair, streaked with premature grey that spoke of hardship born before its time, was partially covered by a worn headscarf that had slipped back as she worked. There was something in her posture, a weariness that seemed to go beyond physical exhaustion, that made Elijah's heart stir with compassion. This was a woman who had carried burdens, who had made hard choices, who had watched her resources dwindle day by day until she was reduced to gathering sticks in the heat of the day. The prophet paused for a moment, studying her face as she worked. In her features, he could read the story of the drought's impact on ordinary people. Her cheeks were hollow, her eyes shadowed with the particular kind of worry that comes from watching a child grow thin. Yet there was also a quiet dignity about her, a refusal to surrender to despair, even in the face of seemingly impossible circumstances. "Excuse me," Elijah called softly, his voice rough from thirst and travel. The woman looked up, startled. Her eyes widened slightly as she took in the appearance of this stranger. His rough clothing, his weathered features, the staff in his hand that marked him as a traveller from far away. In her gaze, Elijah could see the wariness that had become second nature to people in these hard times. Strangers might bring news, trade or help, but they might also bring additional mouths to feed when food was already desperately scarce. "Please," Elijah continued, his manner gentle and respectful, "could you bring me a little water in a cup, that I may drink?" The request hung in the air between them. Water, in this time of drought, was precious beyond measure. Every drop had to be carried from wells that were increasingly distant and depleted. Yet something in the prophet's manner, perhaps the genuine need in his voice, or the courtesy with which he had made his request, caused the woman to hesitate rather than refuse outright. She studied his face for a long moment, as if trying to read his character in his features. What she saw there must have reassured her, for she slowly straightened, her bundle of sticks still clutched in her arms. "I will bring you water," she said simply, her voice carrying the accent of this coastal region, but also a warmth that suggested a heart not yet hardened by suffering. As she turned toward the town, Elijah felt a stirring of gratitude. Here, in this foreign place, this Gentile woman was willing to share her precious water with a Hebrew stranger. It was a small act of kindness, but in a world grown harsh with want, small kindnesses took on the weight of great acts of mercy. But the Lord had sent him here for more than water, and Elijah knew that his true test and hers was yet to come. "Wait," he called gently, as she began to walk away, "and please bring me a morsel of bread in your hand." The woman stopped as if struck. She turned back to him, and now her face bore an expression of such profound sadness that Elijah felt his heart constrict. The weariness he had noticed before was nothing compared to the look of desperate finality that now clouded her features. "As the Lord your God lives," she replied, and there was no anger in her voice, only a crushing weariness and the terrible honesty of someone who has nothing left to lose. "I do not have bread, only a handful of flour in a bin and a little oil in a jar. See, I am gathering a couple of sticks that I may go in and prepare it for myself and my son, that we may eat it and die." The words fell between them like stones dropping into a deep well. This was not the casual refusal of someone unwilling to share, nor the calculated response of someone hoarding resources. This was the stark reality of a mother who had come to the end of all earthly hope, who had measured her remaining provisions with the careful precision of someone planning a final meal. Elijah felt the weight of her despair, but he also felt the stirring of something else, the peculiar lifting of spirit that came when he sensed the Lord was about to move in power. How often had he seen this pattern? The moment when human resources failed completely was precisely the moment when divine intervention began. "Do not fear," he said, and his voice carried a new authority, a confidence that seemed to come from somewhere beyond his own understanding. The words were not merely a comfort, but a command, spoken with the certainty of someone who had learned to recognize the voice of the Almighty. The woman's eyes widened at the change in his tone. Something had shifted in this stranger's demeanour, as if he had suddenly remembered who he was and whom he served. "Go and do as you have said," Elijah continued, "but make me a small cake from it first and bring it to me, and afterward make some for yourself and your son." The request seemed almost cruel in its audacity. Here was a woman who had just confessed that she and her child were preparing to eat their last meal before death, and this stranger was asking her to give him the first portion. By any human standard of fairness or compassion, the request was outrageous, but Elijah was not speaking from human wisdom now. He was speaking as one who had learned to see beyond the visible, to understand that sometimes the pathway to blessing required actions that seemed to defy common sense. "For thus says the Lord God of Israel," he proclaimed, and now his voice carried the full weight of prophetic authority. "The bin of flour shall not be used up, nor shall the jar of oil run dry, until the day the Lord sends rain on the earth." The promise hung in the air between them, like a bridge spanning an impossible chasm. On one side stood the widow's desperate reality, empty bins, empty jars, and the approaching spectre of death. On the other side stood the word of a God she barely knew, spoken through a stranger whose only credentials were the conviction in his voice and the authority with which he spoke. The woman stared at him, her mind undoubtedly racing. Everything in her experience told her that flour and oil, once consumed, were gone forever. Everything she had learned about the world spoke against the possibility of vessels that never emptied, of resources that renewed themselves. She had no reason to trust this foreigner, no evidence that his God was any more real or powerful than the gods her neighbours worshipped. Yet something in his eyes, something in the absolute certainty with which he had spoken, gave her pause. She had lived long enough to recognise truth when she heard it, even when that truth seemed to contradict everything she thought she knew about the world. The choice before her was stark and simple, yet it carried implications that reached far beyond the immediate moment. She could refuse, clinging to what little she had, and eat her final meal with her son in the privacy of her own home. Or she could trust stepping out in faith toward a promise that seemed too wonderful to believe, risking the immediate needs of her child on the word of a stranger's God. As she stood there in the dusty street of Zarephath, with her bundle of sticks still clutched in her arms, and the prophet's words echoing in her mind, the widow found herself at one of those crossroads that define a life. Her next decision would determine not only whether she and her son lived or died, but whether they would become part of a story that would be told for generations to come. A story of faith rewarded, of divine provision, and of the God who sees beyond the boundaries that divide nations and peoples. The sun beat down upon them both as she weighed her choice, but in that moment of decision, neither the heat nor the hunger nor the desperate circumstances seemed to matter. All that mattered was whether she would choose to believe that the impossible might, just possibly, be true. The widow stood motionless for what seemed like an eternity, though in reality it was perhaps only the span of a few heartbeats. In that suspended moment, the entire universe seemed to be waiting for her decision. The very air around them felt charged with possibility, as if creation itself was holding its breath to see whether faith would triumph over fear, whether hope would overcome the stark mathematics of survival. Elijah watched her face carefully, seeing the battle that raged within her soul. He had delivered the word of the Lord as he had been commanded, but now the choice was hers alone to make. The prophet knew from long experience that God's miracles often hinged not on human understanding, but on human obedience, not on the ability to see how a promise might be fulfilled, but on the willingness to act as if it already had been. The woman's eyes moved from Elijah's face to the bundle of sticks in her arms, then toward the town gates where her small home awaited, where her son was undoubtedly waiting for her return, probably listening for the sound of her footsteps that would signal the beginning of their final meal together. She thought of his thin face, his two bright eyes that spoke of a child who had learned too young what it meant to be hungry, and her heart clenched with the fierce protectiveness of motherhood. Yet something else stirred within her as well, a memory perhaps of stories she had heard as a child about the God of the Hebrews, the one who was said to part seas and rain bread from heaven. Or perhaps it was simpler than that, nothing more than the recognition that she'd already lost everything that could be lost, and in that place of complete surrender there was a strange kind of freedom. "I will do as you have said," she whispered finally, her voice so quiet that Elijah had to lean forward to hear her words. The decision, once made, seemed to infuse her with new energy. She straightened her shoulders, adjusted her grip on the bundle of sticks, and began walking toward the town gates with a purpose that had been absent from her movements before. Elijah followed at a respectful distance, marvelling at the courage it must have taken for her to choose trust over terror, faith over the apparent facts of her situation. The narrow streets of Zarephath were largely empty in the heat of midday, but the few people they encountered looked at the odd pair with curiosity. The widow, known to her neighbours as a woman facing starvation, was walking with determined steps beside a foreign stranger whose very presence seemed to radiate an unusual intensity. Word would spread quickly through the small community that something unusual was happening at the house of the widow woman. Her home, when they reached it, was modest even by the standards of a fishing town. The flat-roofed dwelling was built of the local stone, its walls weathered by countless seasons of Mediterranean storms. A small courtyard in front contained an outdoor oven that had seen little use in recent weeks, its stones cold and covered with a fine layer of dust. A few clay pots stood in the shade, and a wooden door, worn smooth by years of use, led into the main room of the house. As they approached, the door opened and a boy appeared, perhaps 10 or 11 years old, with his mother's dark eyes and hair. His frame was thin in the way that spoke of prolonged hunger, but his face lit up with genuine joy at seeing his mother return. That joy dimmed slightly as he noticed a stranger accompanying her, replaced by the cautious curiosity of a child who had learned to be wary of unexpected changes in routine. "Mother?" he said, his voice carrying a question that encompassed much more than the single word could express. The widow reached out and touched her son's face gently, a gesture that spoke of infinite tenderness and perhaps also of farewell. "This is Elijah, a prophet of the Lord God of Israel," she said simply. "We're going to prepare food and he will eat with us." The boy's eyes widened. In their current circumstances, sharing food with anyone, even a guest, represented an act of generosity that bordered on the impossible. Yet he had learned to trust his mother's judgment, and if she said this man would eat with them, then somehow it would be so. Inside, the house was cool and dim, a welcome relief from the blazing heat outside. The main room served as both living area and kitchen, with sleeping quarters in a small adjoining chamber. Clay storage jars lined one wall, most of them standing empty like silent witnesses to the family's dwindling resources. Only 2 containers held anything of value. A small bin that contained the handful of flour the widow had mentioned, and an equally small jar that held the last precious drops of oil. The widow set down her bundle of sticks and began the familiar ritual of preparing a fire. She arranged the wood carefully in the outdoor oven, knowing that every stick must count, every flame must serve its purpose. As she worked, Elijah and the boy watched in respectful silence, each lost in his own thoughts about what was about to unfold. When the fire was burning steadily, the widow went to retrieve her flour and oil. She opened the bin and looked inside, seeing the meagre handful of grain that represented all that stood between her family and starvation. For a moment her resolve wavered. The practical voice of experience whispered that she was being foolish, that she was about to sacrifice her child's last meal on the word of a stranger. But then she remembered the authority in Elijah's voice when he had spoken his promise, the absolute certainty that had rung in his words like a bell struck in a clear mountain air. She had heard many people speak in her lifetime, merchants making promises they wouldn't keep, neighbours offering help they couldn't deliver, officials making proclamations that meant nothing. This had been different. This had carried the weight of truth spoken by someone who knew the one who held the universe in his hands. With steady hands, she measured out the flour, not all of it, but enough to make a small loaf, as Elijah had requested. She added the precious oil, drop by careful drop, then water from their dwindling supply. As she kneaded the dough, she found herself praying to the God of Israel, a God she knew only by reputation, but whom she was now trusting with everything she held dear. The bread baked quickly in the hot oven, filling the small courtyard with an aroma that made all their mouths water and their stomachs clench with longing. When it was finished, golden brown and still steaming, the widow placed it on a wooden plate and carried it to where Elijah sat waiting. "Here," she said simply, offering him the bread that might well be the last her household would ever eat. Elijah received the loaf with the gravity it deserved, understanding that he held in his hands not just food, but an act of faith that would echo through eternity. He broke it carefully, offering portions to both the widow and her son before taking any for himself. The bread was simple fare, coarse flour baked with skill born of necessity, but it tasted like the finest feast to 3 people who had known real hunger. As they ate, a comfortable silence settled over the small courtyard. The bread satisfied their immediate hunger, but more than that, it seemed to nourish something deeper. Hope, perhaps, or the peculiar peace that comes from taking a step of faith and finding solid ground beneath one's feet. When the meal was finished, the inevitable moment arrived. The widow rose to check her storage containers, knowing that according to every law of nature and economy, they should now be empty. The flour bin should contain nothing but dust and remnants, the oil jar nothing but the stained clay at its bottom. She opened the flour bin first, and her breath caught in her throat. Where she had expected to find emptiness, there was flour, not the handful that had remained before, but the same amount that had been there that morning. Her hands trembled as she reached into the jar, running the grain through her fingers to assure herself that she was not dreaming. Next came the oil jar. She lifted it carefully, feeling its weight, hearing the liquid slosh against the sides. It was full as it had been when she had first measured out the precious oil for their bread. "Mother," her son whispered, seeing the wonder and disbelief that played across her features. "The word of the Lord is true," she breathed, her voice filled with awe. "The flour and oil have not diminished. They are just as they were before." From that day forward, the miracle continued. Each morning, the widow would wake expecting to find her containers empty, only to discover them filled with the same amounts they had held the day before. She would measure out flour for the day's bread, pour oil for cooking, and use what was needed to sustain her household and their guest. But each time she checked, morning, noon, and evening, the levels remained constant, as if invisible hands were replenishing what had been taken. Word of the miracle spread slowly through Zarephath. Neighbours who had expected to attend a funeral instead saw smoke rising daily from the widow's oven. They saw the boy playing in the courtyard with more energy than he had shown in months. They saw the foreign prophet living in their midst, his presence somehow bringing blessing rather than burden to the household that sheltered him. Some whispered that it was sorcery, others that the gods were showing favour to the widow for her kindness to strangers. But the widow herself knew better. She had witnessed firsthand the power of the God of Israel, the one who could multiply resources that seemed exhausted, who could bring abundance from scarcity, who could sustain life when death seemed certain. As weeks turned into months, the relationship between the widow, her son, and Elijah deepened into something like family. The prophet helped with daily tasks, told stories of his journeys and the wonders he had witnessed, and taught them both about the nature and character of the God he served. The boy, who had never known a father's presence, began to look up to Elijah with the mixture of respect and affection that a son shows to a beloved elder. For his part, Elijah found in this simple household something he had rarely experienced in his years of prophetic ministry, the warmth of ordinary human fellowship. Here, far from the palaces and temples where he usually delivered his messages, he discovered the profound joy of seeing God's love expressed through daily provision, through the laughter of a child who was no longer hungry, through the grateful smile of a woman who had learned to trust in the impossible. The jar and jug that never emptied became more than just a miracle of physical provision. They became symbols of a deeper truth, that the God of Israel was not limited by human boundaries, that his love extended beyond the chosen people to encompass all who would trust in him, that his power was sufficient to meet every need of those who placed their faith in his promises. In the small house in Zarephath, as the drought continued to devastate the surrounding lands, a different kind of abundance flourished. It was an abundance measured not just in flour and oil, but in faith rewarded, hope restored, and the quiet joy of lives sustained by the inexhaustible love of the Almighty. The seasons had begun to change, in the way they do even during the harshest droughts, with subtle shifts in the angle of sunlight, and the patterns of wind that speak to those who know how to listen. Elijah had now been living in the widow's household for many months, and what had begun as a desperate act of faith had settled into a rhythm of daily miracle. Each morning brought the same wonder, jars that should have been empty, filled with provision, hope renewed with the rising of the sun. The boy had grown stronger during this time, his cheeks regaining some of their childhood roundness, his eyes bright with the vitality that comes from adequate nourishment. He had become Elijah's shadow, an eager student, hanging on every word the prophet spoke about the wonders of God, helping with small tasks around the house, and bringing a lightness to their days that reminded all of them what joy looked like. His laughter had become one of the most precious sounds in that small courtyard, pure and musical, the kind of laughter that makes adults remember what it felt like to see the world as a place of infinite possibility. When he played with the wooden toys he had carved under Elijah's guidance, when he helped his mother tend their small herb garden, when he sat listening to stories of lions' dens and burning bushes, the boy radiated the particular happiness of a child who knows he is loved and secure. The widow, too, had blossomed during these months of miraculous provision. The constant worry that had carved lines around her eyes had softened, replaced by a quiet confidence that spoke of faith tested and proven true. She had learned to trust not just in the daily renewal of flour and oil, but in the character of the God who provided them. Her relationship with Elijah had evolved from desperate gratitude to genuine friendship, seasoned with the deep respect she held for his calling and his God. In the evenings, when the heat of the day had passed, the three of them would often sit together in the courtyard, watching the stars emerge in the clear sky. Elijah would tell them stories of his people's history, of Abraham's faith, of Moses' courage, of David's psalms, and gradually the widow and her son came to understand that they were not merely recipients of divine charity, but participants in a story much larger than themselves. It was during one of these peaceful evening conversations that the boy first began to cough. At first it seemed like nothing, perhaps a bit of dust in the throat, or the dry air that had been their constant companion throughout the drought. The widow offered him water, and he drank gratefully, the coughing subsiding as quickly as it had begun. They thought nothing more of it, and continued their conversation about the time when Elijah had called down fire from heaven to consume a sacrifice on Mount Carmel. But the next morning the boy woke with a flush in his cheeks that spoke of fever rather than health. His mother noticed immediately, the way mothers always do, and pressed her palm to his forehead with the practised concern of one who had nursed many childhood illnesses. He was warm, not dangerously so, but enough to cause worry. "It's nothing serious," she assured Elijah when she saw the concern in the prophet's eyes. "Children often take fevers during the changing of seasons. I have herbs that will help, and with rest he'll be well in a few days." Elijah nodded, but something in his spirit was troubled. He had learned over his years of walking with God to pay attention to such stirrings, even when they seemed to contradict the evidence of his natural senses. Still, he kept his concerns to himself, and joined the widow in tending to the boy with all the skill and care they could muster. For 2 days the illness seemed manageable. The boy remained in bed, accepting the herbal teas his mother prepared, sleeping more than usual, but still able to sit up and take some nourishment. His fever rose and fell in the typical pattern of childhood ailments, and there were moments when he seemed almost his normal self, asking Elijah to tell him again about the ravens that had brought bread and meat to the brook Cherith. But on the third morning, something changed. The boy's breathing became laboured, and his fever spiked higher than before. His eyes, when he managed to open them, seemed to look through rather than at the people who bent over him with growing concern. The flush in his cheeks deepened to an alarming red, and his small body trembled with chills that no amount of blankets could warm. The widow worked with desperate efficiency, trying every remedy she knew. She brewed stronger teas from the herbs that had always worked before, applied cool cloths to bring down the fever, and held her son close when the chills made him shake uncontrollably. But despite all her efforts, his condition continued to deteriorate. Elijah found himself in a terrible position. He was a prophet, accustomed to speaking with divine authority about the will of God, yet here he felt helpless in the face of a child suffering. He prayed earnestly, seeking guidance, seeking healing, seeking any word from the Lord about what was happening and why. But the heavens seemed silent. offering no immediate answer to his urgent petitions. By the fourth day, the boy could barely keep his eyes open. His breathing had become so shallow that both his mother and Elijah found themselves leaning close, just to assure themselves that he was still alive. The widow had not slept in 2 nights, maintaining a constant vigil beside her son's bed, and the strain was beginning to show in every line of her face. Perhaps, she said to Elijah, during one of the boy's brief periods of peaceful sleep, perhaps we should send for the physician from the next town. I know we have little to pay him with, but surely the physicians have no more power over this illness than we do, Elijah replied gently. This is not a sickness that earthly medicine can cure. The words hung between them, carrying implications that neither wanted to fully acknowledge. If earthly medicine could not help, if the herbs and treatments that had always worked before were proving useless, then they were facing something beyond the normal course of illness and recovery. They were facing the possibility that God might be calling this beloved child home. On the 5th morning, as the sun rose with its customary indifference to human suffering, the inevitable happened. The widow, who had dozed fitfully in her chair beside the bed, was awakened by a silence that was somehow more alarming than any sound could have been. She looked at her son and knew immediately that something fundamental had changed. His face, which had been flushed with fever, was now pale and still. His chest no longer rose and fell with the rhythm of breathing. The boy was gone. The widow's scream of anguish pierced the morning air, a sound so raw and primal that it seemed to tear through the very fabric of hope itself. She gathered her son's lifeless body into her arms, rocking back and forth as tears streamed down her face. "What have you done to me, O man of God?" she cried, turning to Elijah with eyes blazing with grief and accusation. "Have you come to bring my sin to remembrance and to kill my son?" The words struck Elijah like physical blows. Here was a woman who had trusted him, who had shared her last meal based on his promise, who had opened her home to him for months. And now, in the presence of God's prophet, her only child lay dead. Without a word, Elijah gently took the boy from his mother's arms. "Give me your son," he said quietly, and despite her grief, something in his tone made her release her hold on the child. Elijah carried the boy to the upper room where he had been staying, laying him carefully on the bed. Then he fell upon his face before God, crying out with all the passion of his prophetic calling. "O Lord my God, have you also brought tragedy on the widow with whom I lodge, by killing her son?" 3 times Elijah stretched himself upon the child, calling out each time, "O Lord my God, I pray, let this child's soul come back to him." The silence that followed seemed to stretch into eternity. Then, like the first breath of dawn, after the longest night, the boy's chest rose. His eyes fluttered open, clear and bright, and he looked up at Elijah with wonder. "Teacher?" he whispered, his voice weak but unmistakably alive. Elijah gathered the boy in his arms, his own eyes wet with tears of joy and gratitude. "Come," he said, "let us go to your mother." When the widow saw her son walking down the stairs, alive and whole, she fell to her knees. "Now by this I know that you are a man of God," she declared through her tears, "and that the word of the Lord in your mouth is the truth." The miracle at Zarephath teaches us profound truths that echo through the ages. First, we learn about faith in scarcity, how the widow trusted God's promise, even when her cupboards were bare and death seemed certain. Her willingness to give from her need rather than her abundance shows us that God often asks us to step forward in faith before we can see how he will provide. Second, we see the power of obedience before understanding. The widow didn't need to comprehend how flour and oil could multiply. She simply needed to trust the word of the Lord and act upon it. Blessings flowed not because she understood the miracle, but because she believed in the one who promised it. Third, this story reveals God's care beyond all boundaries. Here was a Hebrew prophet ministered to by a Gentile widow, showing that God's love transcends nationality, culture, and religion. The miracle in Zarephath foreshadowed the day when God's salvation would be offered to all nations. Finally, through Elijah's intercession for the dead boy, we glimpse God's ultimate power over life and death itself. This miracle points forward to the resurrection, hope that would one day be fully revealed in Christ, reminding us that with God, even death is not the final word. As our story draws to a close, I invite you to consider the empty jars in your own life, those places where resources seem exhausted, where hope feels depleted, where you wonder if God sees your need. The widow of Zarephath discovered that the God of impossible things delights in filling what appears empty, in multiplying what seems insufficient, in bringing life where death has reigned. Perhaps tonight, as you prepare for rest, you can release your own impossibilities into his capable hands. Trust that the same God who filled flour jars and oil vessels in ancient Zarephath is still working miracles today, sometimes dramatic and visible, sometimes quiet and hidden, but always rooted in his unchanging love for his children. The sun has set over that ancient town by the sea, and a gentle breeze stirs the olive trees, where a widow once gathered sticks in desperation, and found instead a destiny of faith. In that small house, the jars remained full, the boy grew strong, and 3 hearts learned to trust in the God of endless provision. May you rest tonight knowing that your own story is being written by the same loving hand, and that tomorrow's provision is already prepared by the one who never fails to keep his promises. Sleep well, dear friend, and remember, with God the jar never truly empties and hope is always renewable.